Ladies and gentlemen, let's begin not with politics, but with a map. Picture one in your mind. You see lines, borders, colors showing nations in their neat shapes. But here's the truth, those neat borders are not simply political inventions. They are echoes of mountains, rivers, deserts, seas, the earth itself dictating where people can live, where armies can march, and where empires can rise or collapse. This is the central idea of prisoners of geography, that the fate of nations is not written only in the hearts of leaders or the ideals of their people, but in the mountains they cannot cross, the deserts they cannot farm, the rivers they must control. Geography is destiny. Think about it. Why is Russia always suspicious of the West? Why does China obsess over its southern seas? Why is Africa, rich in resources, still struggling to rise to its full potential? Why does America look both inward and outward, a fortress and a beacon? The answers are not found only in politics or economics, but in the lay of the land. Tim Marshall takes us across 10 maps, each a story of how geography shapes history. And in each story, you'll find that leaders, even the most powerful, are far less free than they appear. They are trapped, just like us, by mountains, rivers, climate, and soil. The earth is not just where history happens, it writes the script. The flatland problem. At the core of Russia's anxiety lies the North European plain. This is a flat stretch of land that runs from France and Germany, across Poland, and directly into the Russian heartland. No mountains, no great rivers to act as a shield, just open land. If you are a Russian leader, that plain is not an opportunity. It is a nightmare. It is an open door for invaders. And indeed, history has proven this fear right. In 1812, Napoleon marched across it with his Grande Armée, reaching Moscow before winter broke him. In 1941, Hitler's armies stormed through the same corridor, devastating everything in their path. So, Russia learned a lesson: survival depends on pushing your borders outward, creating buffer zones. Poland, Ukraine, the Baltic states, these are not just neighbors. To Moscow, they are shields, human shields if necessary, against the endless invasions that history has burned into Russian memory. The ice problem. But Russia has another prison: ice. Look at its northern coastline, thousands of miles along the Arctic Ocean. For much of the year, it is locked by ice, unusable for shipping or naval power. A superpower with no warm water ports is like a giant with shackled arms. This explains centuries of Russian expansionism. The Tsars wanted Crimea because Sevastopol gave access to the Black Sea. They wanted influence in the Balkans because the Bosporus Straits were the key to the Mediterranean. They wanted Vladivostok, even though it, too, is ice-prone. And today, Putin's hold on Crimea is not simply nationalist bravado, it is geography. Without warm water ports, Russia is bottled up, a land giant with little ocean reach. The size illusion. We think of Russia as huge, and it is, but much of that territory is inhospitable. Siberia, for instance, is a frozen wilderness. It holds oil, gas, and minerals, but also permafrost and unbearable cold. Population density is thin. The true Russian core is far smaller, the land between St. Petersburg, Moscow, and the fertile belt reaching south toward Ukraine. This is the heartland, the part of Russia that has always mattered. The eastern threat. And then there's the east. While Europe haunts Russia with memories of invasions, Asia looms too. China, once weak and fragmented, is now strong and hungry for resources. The sparsely populated Russian Far East, rich in timber and minerals, lies next to China's teeming population. This is a long-term anxiety for Moscow. Will it hold on to this territory if China decides to reach northward? Paranoia is policy. Paranoia is policy. So, when you put this together, the flat plains, the icebound ports, the vulnerable East, you understand why Russian leaders, from the Tsars to Stalin to Putin, have ruled with paranoia. They see threats everywhere because geography has taught them to. Every buffer they create must be defended, every port must be secured, every border pushed outward. This is why Russia meddles in Ukraine. Why it leans into Central Asia. Why it fears NATO expansion like a dagger pointed at its heart. These are not simply political choices. They are geographic imperatives. And so, the Russian people and their leaders remain, as Tim Marshall says, prisoners of geography. Chapter 2, China, the Middle Kingdom's Walls and Gateways. When we think of China today, we see a rising superpower, skyscrapers, booming trade, the world's factory floor. But to really understand China, we need to step back, zoom out, and look at the land itself. Because geography explains why China calls itself the Middle Kingdom, not just out of pride, but out of the sense that it has always been hemmed in, surrounded, forced to look inward before it could look outward. The heartland, the North China Plain. At the very core of China lies the North China Plain, a wide, fertile expanse fed by two great rivers, the Yellow River, Huanghe, and the Yangtze, Changjiang. This plain is where Chinese civilization was born. It is China's breadbasket, producing rice and wheat, sustaining its people for millennia. But it also created a problem: abundance breeds people, and people need control. Unlike Russia, where geography spreads people out, China's geography funnels them into crowded river valleys. Governing China has always been like trying to govern a family of hundreds all living in the same house. If you don't keep order, chaos erupts. This is why, historically, China has favored strong central authority, emperors, dynasties, party leaders. Without a firm grip, the country fragments. The natural walls. Now imagine China on a map. It looks large, but it is actually boxed in by walls of nature. To the west, the Himalayas, the highest mountains on Earth, blocking entry into India. To the southwest, the Tibetan Plateau, a frozen highland, nearly uninhabitable. To the northwest, the vast Gobi Desert and Taklamakan Desert, offering little water, little life. To the east, the Pacific Ocean, protection, but also a limit, keeping China hemmed in. These walls protected China for centuries, allowing its civilization to flourish without constant invasions from every direction. But they also created isolation. China could not easily expand outward, so it looked inward, developing a strong cultural identity and a sense of superiority. The nomadic threats of the north. But there was one weak spot: the north. Above the Great Wall lay the steppes of Mongolia, home to horse-riding nomads. And from that flat expanse came repeated invasions. The Xiongnu, the Mongols under Genghis Khan, later the Manchus, all swept down into China across this northern frontier. This is why the Great Wall of China exists. It was not just a monument, it was geography turned into stone. The Chinese weren't walling themselves in, they were walling the invaders out. But the wall wasn't perfect, and invasions still came, shaping China's deep mistrust of outsiders. Rivers, lifelines and curses. The Yellow and Yangtze rivers gave life, but they also took it away. They flood unpredictably, sometimes devastating entire regions. The Yellow River is even called China's sorrow. For centuries, governments rose and fell depending on how well they could manage these rivers. In this way, geography directly shaped politics. To rule China meant to control the water. Even today, the Communist Party's authority partly rests on its ability to provide stability, food, and order in the face of nature. The South China Question. Now, look south. Southern China, with its jungles, hills, and rivers, is different from the north. It's warmer, wetter, and historically harder to control. Yet it's also closer to the sea, closer to trade, to pirates, to foreign contact. Guangzhou, Hong Kong, Shanghai, these are gateways that brought both wealth and humiliation. In the 19th century, when Western powers arrived, they pried open these ports with gunboats. The Opium Wars, the carving up of China into spheres of influence, this was geography exploited by outsiders. The flat coastline and deepwater ports made China vulnerable, and it's a wound still remembered today. Tibet and Xinjiang, the imperial fringe. Let's not forget the western edges, Tibet and Xinjiang. These are not natural parts of China, they are imperial acquisitions, held because they are buffers. Tibet is crucial because it holds the source of China's great rivers. Whoever controls Tibet controls water for billions, not just in China but across Asia. Xinjiang, meanwhile, is China's gateway to Central Asia, and today, a crucial link in the Belt and Road Initiative. But these areas are also restive, culturally distinct, and resistant to Beijing's rule. Geography makes them vital, but also makes governing them a constant struggle. The sea problem. For centuries, China was a land power. The ocean was seen as dangerous, unpredictable. But in the modern age, sea power means wealth. And here lies China's great dilemma, the South China Sea. Look at the map. China's coastline is hemmed in by what's called the first island chain: Japan, Taiwan, the Philippines. These islands block China's navy, just as surely as mountains block its west. To break out, to secure shipping lanes for its energy and trade, China must dominate the South China Sea. That's why it builds artificial islands, why it clashes with Vietnam and the Philippines, why it insists Taiwan must never be independent. Geography dictates it. If China doesn't control these seas, it remains vulnerable, its economy exposed. A nation always hemmed in. So, when you put it all together, you see the paradox of China. Blessed with fertile plains and rivers that birthed a mighty civilization. Protected by mountains and deserts that kept it safe. Yet cursed by internal divisions, dangerous floods, nomadic raids, and humiliating invasions from the sea. China's leaders today, like Xi Jinping, are no freer than the emperors of old. They must deal with rivers that flood, minorities on the fringes, rivals at sea, and the endless need for strong central power to hold it all together. And so, China, for all its power and ambition, remains, like Russia, a prisoner of geography. Chapter 3, The United States, Geography's Golden Child. When you look at the world map, America almost looks as if it were designed to become a superpower. Unlike Russia, with its frozen ports, or China, boxed in by mountains and deserts, the United States is blessed with land that invites prosperity and protection. Its geography is not a set of chains. It's a launch pad. And that makes the story of the United States quite different. It's about how abundance creates opportunity, but also how geography still pulls the strings behind the scenes. 2 oceans, the Great Moats. First, let's talk about the oceans. On either side of the United States lie the Atlantic and Pacific, 2 vast moats that protect it from invasion. Think of history's great empires, Rome, Persia, even China. They all faced endless wars because enemies were always just across a border. The US is different. To reach its heartland, an enemy would need to cross thousands of miles of ocean. Napoleon couldn't do it. Hitler couldn't do it. The Soviets couldn't do it. This protection gave America the chance to grow in safety, focusing on building at home rather than constantly defending itself. The gift of rivers. Now, zoom in on the land itself. The US has something extraordinary, the Mississippi River System. Picture it, one of the largest, most navigable networks of rivers on Earth, stretching from Minnesota down to New Orleans, with branches like the Missouri and Ohio rivers spreading out like veins. These rivers cut through flat, fertile land, the Midwestern plains, some of the best farmland in the world. What does that mean? It means farmers could grow massive surpluses of food and transport it cheaply by boat, long before roads and trains existed. In Europe, geography forced countries to fight over scarce farmland. In America, the land seemed endless and rich. Abundance shaped the mindset, growth, expansion, optimism, the heartland. This fertile interior, the American Midwest, is the true core of U.S. power. From Iowa's cornfields to Kansas wheat to the oil-rich plains of Texas, this region produces not just food but energy. And it's protected by natural barriers, the Rocky Mountains in the west, the Appalachians in the east, and the Gulf of Mexico to the south. Think of it this way, if Russia's geography breeds paranoia, America's geography breeds confidence. The land itself feels secure, generous, almost benevolent. Expansion made easy. Because the geography was so favorable, expansion across the continent felt inevitable. Rivers allowed easy settlement. The plains offered farmland. The mountains, while formidable, could be crossed through valleys and passes. By the mid-19th century, the U.S. had stretched from sea to shining sea. This was not just ambition, it was geography giving permission. Few nations have ever had such an easy time expanding across an entire continent. Canada and Mexico, harmless neighbors. Look north, Canada. A friendly neighbor, vast but sparsely populated, with no need or ability to threaten the U.S. Look south, Mexico. A country with deserts and mountains limiting its capacity to rival America, and historically weaker militarily and economically. This meant the U.S. never had to spend centuries battling immediate neighbors like France and Germany did. Instead, it could focus outward, toward trade, commerce, and eventually, empire. Warm water ports and global reach. Unlike Russia, the United States has excellent ports. Boston, New York, New Orleans, Los Angeles, San Francisco, all deep, ice-free harbors. These allowed trade with Europe, Africa, Asia, and beyond. And once the U.S. built its navy, these ports became the launch pads of global power projection. The construction of the Panama Canal in the early 20th century only strengthened this advantage, allowing ships to move quickly between the Atlantic and Pacific. Geography had already blessed America, and engineering doubled the gift. The one weakness, race and the South. But geography is not only rivers and mountains. It is also climate and soil. And in the American South, the warm climate made cotton plantations thrive. That economic system built on slavery created the great fracture of the United States, the Civil War. In this sense, geography both united and divided America. The fertile North fueled industrialization, the fertile South fueled slavery and division. That wound still echoes in American politics today. The 20th century, from fortress to global policeman. By the 20th century, America's geographic blessings had made it a giant in waiting. Safe from invasion, rich in food and energy, connected by rivers and ports, with friendly neighbors, all it needed was time. World War I and World War II provided the moment. Europe and Asia were devastated. The US, protected by oceans, emerged strong, its industries intact. From that moment, America became the world's leading economic and military power. And here's where geography pushes again. To remain safe at home, America must project power abroad. If Europe or Asia is dominated by a single rival, that rival could eventually challenge America across the oceans. So the US inserts itself into global affairs, NATO in Europe, bases in Japan, fleets in the Pacific. Its geography allows retreat into isolation, but its interests demand global reach. Today's geography lesson. So what does America's geography mean today? It means the US will always have immense advantages. Secure borders. Abundant farmland and resources. Navigable rivers and warm water ports. Neighbors who pose no existential threat. But it also means America has responsibilities it cannot escape. To protect its trade and its allies, it must guard the Atlantic and Pacific, keep an eye on Europe, watch Asia closely, and above all, ensure that no other nation can dominate its hemisphere. Geography's child. So, when you look at the map, you see why the United States rose so quickly and why it remains so powerful. It is, in many ways, geography's golden child. But even golden children are still bound by the land. The US can choose isolation for a while, but eventually the oceans that protect it also connect it. The Mississippi that feeds it also ties it to global markets. The ports that enrich it also drag it into conflict. And so, like every nation, the United States is both free and bound, blessed by geography, yet still its prisoner. Chapter 4, Western Europe, Rivers, Mountains, and Rivalries. If the United States was born lucky, Europe was born crowded. When you look at the map of Western Europe, you don't see vast plains or unbroken heartlands. You see a patchwork, mountains cutting across valleys, rivers splitting territories, peninsulas jutting into seas. Geography here didn't encourage unity, it demanded rivalry. The favorable location. Europe sits at the western edge of the Eurasian landmass, with access to both the Atlantic Ocean and the Mediterranean Sea. This was a gift: easy trade routes, warm water ports, and coastlines full of natural harbors. Unlike Russia, Western Europe never struggled for access to the sea. This explains why European states, though small compared to empires like China or Russia, were able to send ships across the world. Geography made Europe a cradle of maritime exploration, and eventually colonial domination. The rivers that connect and divide. Europe's rivers, the Rhine, the Danube, the Seine, the Thames, were short compared to the Mississippi or the Yangtze. But they were perfectly placed, navigable, flowing into seas, creating natural highways of trade. This meant that even small states could be rich. Think of the Netherlands, a tiny patch of land, but with rivers and ports that made it a commercial powerhouse. But those same rivers, while connecting local economies, also separated cultures. Each valley, each region could flourish on its own, which meant there was no pressing reason to unify into a giant empire. Unlike China's broad plains, Europe's geography bred fragmentation. Mountains, peninsulas, and islands. Look closer and you see the Pyrenees, the Alps, the Carpathians, natural walls that kept nations apart. The Iberian Peninsula grew into Spain and Portugal, the British Isles grew apart as England and Scotland, then eventually Britain. Italy remained fractured until the 19th century, in part because the Apennine Mountains and surrounding seas isolated its regions. Europe's geography gave each corner its own identity, which, over centuries, hardened into nations. War as a way of life. And so, for centuries, Europe was not one empire but many states, constantly jostling for power. Geography forced them into proximity without unity. The result: endless wars. The 100 Years' War. The Napoleonic Wars. World Wars I and II. But here's the twist: while wars devastated Europe, they also fueled innovation. Competition drove states to build better ships, better weapons, better industries. Europe's fragmentation became the engine of its global dominance. The post-war Union. By the mid-20th century, after two catastrophic world wars, Europeans realized the truth: geography had doomed them to conflict unless they changed course. And so came the European Union, an attempt to bind states together economically so that geography would no longer divide them politically. But still, divisions remain. The North and South, the East and West, the coastal rich and the inland poor, all reflect geography's stubborn hand. Europe's prison. So Europe's story is this: blessed with seas, rivers, and harbors that gave it global reach, but cursed with mountains and valleys that kept it divided. Geography made Europe the birthplace of world empires, but also the graveyard of millions in war. Even today, when leaders speak of unity, the land beneath them whispers division. Microphone emoji, Chapter 5, Africa, a land rich in resources, poor in geography. Now let's turn south, across the Mediterranean, to Africa. If Europe was crowded and divided, Africa was isolated and disconnected. At first glance, Africa seems blessed: vast mineral wealth, fertile lands in some regions, and a position straddling both the Atlantic and Indian Oceans. But look closer, and you see why Africa's geography has been more curse than blessing. The coastline problem. The first issue, the coastline. Europe's coastline is full of bays and harbors, perfect for ships. Africa's, in contrast, is remarkably smooth. Few natural harbors, few navigable inlets. This meant that for centuries, Africans were cut off from the sea, while Europeans built global empires with their harbors. Even when ships did arrive, they could not easily penetrate inland. Why? Because of Africa's second problem. The rivers that don't connect. Africa's rivers are long and powerful: the Congo, the Nile, the Niger, but they are broken by waterfalls and rapids. They don't flow like highways across the land. Instead of uniting regions, they isolate them. You can sail part of the Nile, but then you're blocked by cataracts. The Congo is mighty, but broken. This meant African societies remained fragmented, often localized, without the easy trade networks that rivers created in Europe or the US. The desert and the jungle. Now add the extremes. The Sahara Desert, the largest hot desert in the world, splits North Africa from the rest of the continent. Crossing it was nearly impossible for centuries, keeping sub-Saharan Africa isolated from the Mediterranean world. In Central Africa, thick jungles and disease-bearing mosquitoes made life harsh and connections harder. Malaria, sleeping sickness, and yellow fever killed explorers and settlers alike, limiting development and discouraging large-scale migration. Diversity without unity. As a result, Africa developed extraordinary diversity, thousands of languages, cultures, ethnic groups, but without unifying empires on the scale of China or Rome. When Europeans arrived in the 15th century, they encountered fragmented societies. Geography had prevented Africa from consolidating power, making it vulnerable to outside exploitation. The colonial carve-up. And exploit it they did. The Berlin Conference of 1884-85 divided Africa among European powers with straight lines on a map. But those borders ignored ethnic and geographic realities. Tribes that had little in common were shoved into the same countries, others were split apart. This is one of the cruelest legacies of geography and politics combined. Africa's natural fragmentation made it easy to carve up, and those artificial borders still fuel conflict today. Riches as a curse. Ironically, Africa is immensely wealthy in resources: gold, diamonds, oil, cobalt. But instead of lifting the continent, these riches have often been a curse. Foreign powers came for extraction, not development. Wars have been fought over mines and oil fields, leaving poverty in the shadow of wealth. Africa struggles today. Even now, geography continues to shape Africa's challenges. Lack of navigable rivers means poor internal trade. Harsh deserts and jungles limit agriculture. Borders drawn by outsiders fuel ethnic conflict. But there are glimmers of promise: cities like Lagos, Nairobi, Johannesburg, hubs that overcome geographic limits through technology and global trade. Still, the prison bars of geography are strong, and Africa must climb higher than most to escape them. Microphone emoji, Europe versus Africa, a tale of two geographies. Think of it this way. Europe's geography forced it to fragment, compete, and innovate, leading to global dominance. Africa's geography forced it to isolate, fragment, and struggle, making it vulnerable to outside domination. Two continents, side by side, yet their destinies were written by rivers, deserts, mountains, and coasts long before politics or economics ever entered the stage. Chapter 6, The Middle East, Crossroads of Faith and Oil. When we hear Middle East, we often think of conflict. Wars, borders, religion, oil. But if we peel back the politics, we see the land itself: deserts, rivers, mountains, shaping everything. The Middle East is not cursed by fate. It is bound by geography. The cradle of civilization. This is where it all began. The Tigris and Euphrates rivers, flowing through Mesopotamia, modern Iraq, created fertile soil for some of humanity's first cities: Ur, Babylon, Nineveh. Yet these rivers were also unpredictable, flooding irregularly, forcing societies to invent irrigation, law, and centralized authority. The lesson? Geography demands strong rulers here. Without control of water, there is no life. This early truth still echoes in today's Middle East, where control of rivers, pipelines, and oases determines power. The deserts and the mountains. Now look around Mesopotamia. To the west lies the Syrian desert, to the south the vast Arabian desert. To the north rise the Zagros Mountains of Iran, to the east the mountains of Afghanistan. These features isolate regions from one another. Cities cluster around rivers, but deserts and mountains make unity difficult. This is why the Middle East, despite its ancient civilizations, never unified like China. Instead, it fractured into city-states, caliphates, and kingdoms, often in conflict. The crossroads of faith. The geography also made the Middle East a crossroads. It sits between Europe, Africa, and Asia. Caravans passed through, armies marched across. Religions were born here: Judaism, Christianity, Islam. Each spread along the trade routes of the region. And each left a permanent mark, creating both spiritual richness and political fault lines. Oil, the modern curse. Fast forward to the 20th century. The Middle East is dry, arid, and often poor in farmland. But beneath its sands lies oil, vast reserves, the lifeblood of modern industry. Oil transformed the region's importance overnight. Control of oil fields meant wealth and power. But it also meant foreign intervention, coups, and wars. Britain, the US, the Soviet Union, all became entangled. Borders mattered less than pipelines. Geography gave the Middle East oil, but not peace. The geography of division. Look closer and you see how the land divides. The Sunni heartlands of Arabia versus the Shia strongholds of Iran and southern Iraq, a division reinforced by deserts and mountains. The Levant coast, Lebanon, Israel, Syria, with its fertile lands and access to the Mediterranean, constantly fought over. The Strait of Hormuz and the Suez Canal, choke points where global trade and energy flow through narrow corridors. Whoever controls these points controls the world's economy. Today's Middle East. So when we see conflict, from Iraq to Syria to Yemen, it is not random. It is the same story written again and again: deserts isolating tribes, rivers concentrating power, oil attracting outsiders, religion layering identity onto geography. The Middle East is not doomed. But its geography ensures it will never be simple. It will always be a place where the land both sustains and divides, blesses and curses. Microphone emoji, Chapter 7, South Asia, a subcontinent divided. Now let's move east, to South Asia, home to nearly 2 billion people, more than any other region except East Asia. From the towering Himalayas to the lush Ganges plain, from deserts to tropical coasts, South Asia is a world unto itself. But once again, geography explains both its richness and its troubles. The Great Wall of the North. At the top of the map rise the Himalayas, the highest mountains in the world. They wall off India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh from China. For millennia, they protected South Asia from northern invasion. No armies crossed those peaks, they were simply too high, too deadly. This meant South Asia developed as a distinct civilization, separate from China and the Middle East. Its languages, religions, and cultures flourished in relative isolation. The plains of the rivers. Below the mountains stretched the fertile plains of the Indus and the Ganges. These rivers gave birth to ancient civilizations, Harappa and Mohenjo-Daro in the Indus Valley, and later sustained Hindu and Muslim empires. The soil here is so rich that it feeds hundreds of millions. But fertility comes with density. South Asia is one of the most crowded places on Earth. Governing such a mass of people, spread across rivers and villages, has always been a colossal challenge. The western frontier, Afghanistan and Pakistan. To the northwest lies a weak point, the Khyber Pass, a mountain corridor linking Afghanistan to the Indian subcontinent. Through this pass came countless invaders: Persians, Greeks, Mongols, Turks. Each left a mark, blending cultures, creating diversity but also conflict. This explains why Pakistan, sitting on this frontier, has always been a zone of tension, a crossroads between Central Asia and South Asia, vulnerable yet strategic. The Indian Ocean advantage. South Asia also has something vital: access to the Indian Ocean. Unlike Africa, its coastline has natural harbors and peninsulas, Gujarat, Kerala, Sri Lanka, that linked it to global trade. Arab traders, Portuguese explorers, British merchants, all came to these shores. The ocean gave South Asia wealth, but also drew in conquerors, the colonial legacy. And that brings us to the British. Britain exploited South Asia's geography, its rivers for trade, its coasts for ports, its plains for cotton and wheat. The railways they built weren't for unity, but for extraction. And when they finally left in 1947, they drew borders that sliced through communities: India and Pakistan, later Bangladesh. Millions were displaced, and millions died. Those borders, drawn on maps without regard for rivers, religions, or terrain, still bleed today. Kashmir, sitting between India and Pakistan, remains the most dangerous flashpoint on Earth, a mountain valley with nuclear powers on either side. Internal divisions. But even within India, geography divides. The north, fertile but crowded, prone to flooding. The south, coastal, outward-looking, home to older Dravidian cultures. The west, deserts of Rajasthan, limiting settlement. The east, humid, cyclone-prone Bengal, rich yet vulnerable. India is not one geography but many, held together by politics, culture, and sheer necessity. South Asia's prison. So, like the Middle East, South Asia is rich in history and people, yet bound by land that encourages division. Mountains separating it from neighbors, rivers splitting it internally, coasts that connect it to outsiders more than to itself. This is why South Asia is at once powerful and fragile, a nuclear flashpoint, a rising economic hub, a land of unity and fracture. Its destiny, like all others, is written in its soil, rivers, and mountains. Microphone emoji, Middle East and South Asia together. These two regions share a theme: civilizations born of rivers and mountains, fractured by deserts and borders, inflamed by religion and resources. The Middle East, oil-rich deserts, faith, and choke points of global power. South Asia, fertile plains, dense populations, colonial scars, and nuclear borders. Both remind us that maps are not just lines. They are the prisons and pathways that shape human destiny. Chapter 8, East Asia, Japan and Korea, Mountains and Islands. When we think of East Asia, our eyes often go to China. But just across the seas lie two nations whose geography has shaped their destiny in unique ways: Japan and Korea. Japan, the island fortress. Picture Japan on the map, a chain of islands arcing along the Pacific. At first glance, you might think this is a weakness, isolated, cut off. But in reality, Japan's island geography was its greatest strength. Protected by the sea, Japan avoided the fate of China, which was repeatedly invaded. The Mongols tried, twice, but storms, the famous kamikaze divine winds, destroyed their fleets. Geography kept Japan safe long enough to develop a unique, cohesive culture. But Japan's land is rugged, mountains cover 70% of it. Farmland is scarce. Resources, coal, oil, iron, are minimal. This meant that Japan could survive, but not thrive, without reaching outward. And so, in the 19th and 20th centuries, Japan turned its maritime skill into empire. It industrialized rapidly, built a navy, and expanded across Asia in search of resources it lacked at home. Its defeat in World War II ended the empire, but not its reliance on the seas. Today, Japan is still utterly dependent on maritime trade. Its ships bring in oil from the Middle East, food from abroad, raw materials from across the globe. And so, Japan's prison is this: as safe as its islands are, its lifeblood flows across oceans it cannot fully control. That is why the U.S. Navy's presence in the Pacific is not just welcome, it is essential to Japan's survival. Korea, the shrinking peninsula. Now shift your gaze slightly west to the Korean peninsula. Korea is the opposite of Japan, not an island fortress, but a vulnerable peninsula, squeezed between giants. To the west, China. To the north, Russia. To the east, Japan. This geography explains why Korea has often been a pawn in other powers' games. It was invaded by China, occupied by Japan, and split in two during the Cold War when the US and Soviet Union carved it apart along the 38th parallel. Today, that line remains one of the tensest borders on Earth: North Korea, mountainous and isolated, and South Korea, coastal and prosperous. Geography explains both. The South has flatlands along the coast, perfect for trade and industry. The North is more rugged, inward, harder to connect. And so, East Asia's geography gave us two island and peninsula nations, one wealthy but resource-starved, the other divided and vulnerable. Both remain, in different ways, prisoners of their terrain. Chapter 9, Latin America, the Broken Continent. Now we cross the Pacific and Atlantic to the Americas, specifically Latin America. At first glance, it seems it should be as successful as the United States. It has vast land, rich soil, mountains, rainforests, oil, minerals. And yet, Latin America has lagged behind. Why? Geography again. The mountains and the jungle. Look at the Andes Mountains, a spine running down the continent's west, among the highest and most impenetrable ranges on Earth. Instead of connecting people, the Andes split nations apart. Peru, Chile, Bolivia, each carved into valleys, hard to link together. Then comes the Amazon rainforest, enormous, dense, humid, deadly to infrastructure. Roads and railways are almost impossible to build at scale. For centuries, the Amazon cut off the interior from the coasts, isolating communities and limiting trade. Compare this to the Mississippi River system in the US, which united a continent. Latin America had no such unifier. Its rivers, the Amazon, the Orinoco, are powerful but too wild, broken by rapids, surrounded by inhospitable jungle. The coastline problem. Latin America's coastlines also work against it. Much of the western coast is a cliff face, the Andes drop steeply into the Pacific, leaving few good harbors. The eastern coast, while better, still lacks the abundance of natural harbors seen in Europe or the US. Fewer harbors mean less trade, less naval power. Fragmented nations. All this meant that Latin America developed not as one cohesive power, but as many fragmented states, each struggling to connect its people. Spanish and Portuguese colonization only made this worse, carving artificial borders that didn't match geography. The result, weak states, prone to instability. Brazil, a giant with feet of clay. Take Brazil. On paper, it should be a superpower, enormous, resource-rich, populous. But most of its population hugs the coast. The interior, the Amazon, is nearly empty, cut off by rainforest. Brazil's geography funnels its people outward, toward the Atlantic, not inward toward unity. Latin America's prison. So Latin America's tragedy is this: immense natural riches, but geography that blocks integration. Mountains, jungles, and poor harbors keep nations divided and weak. And so, while the US became a unified colossus, Latin America became a patchwork, struggling still to overcome its land. Chapter 10, The Arctic, the New Frontier. Finally, we travel north, to the top of the world, the Arctic. For centuries, this was a frozen wasteland, a place of ice and legend. But now, as the ice melts, the Arctic is becoming the newest chapter in the story of geography. The ice prison breaks. For most of history, the Arctic Ocean was locked in ice, unusable for shipping, too deadly for settlement. But climate change is melting that ice. Suddenly, what was once a barrier is becoming a highway. Shipping lanes are opening between Asia, Europe, and North America. A journey that once took weeks could take days. The wealth beneath the ice. Beneath the Arctic lie untapped riches, oil, gas, minerals. As the ice recedes, these resources are becoming accessible. Nations are already competing. Russia planting flags under the North Pole, Canada and Norway staking claims, the US asserting rights from Alaska. The military frontier. The Arctic is not empty. It is ringed by powerful nations: Russia, the US, Canada, the Nordic states. As the ice melts, their military presence grows. Bases are being built. Submarines patrol. The Arctic could become not just a trade route, but a battlefield. Indigenous peoples and fragile ecosystems. And let's not forget the people already there: the Inuit, the Sami, and the fragile ecosystems. Geography is changing so fast here that politics can barely keep up. The future's prison. So, the Arctic is a reminder: geography is not static. Climate change is redrawing the map. What was once a frozen prison is opening, creating both opportunity and danger. The Arctic may be the last great test of whether nations can escape the trap of geography, or whether they will fight yet again over the land, the sea, and the riches beneath. Microphone emoji, chapters 8 to 10 together. East Asia, Latin America, the Arctic. East Asia shows us how islands and peninsulas shape nations: Japan's maritime empire, Korea's division. Latin America reveals how mountains and jungles can block progress, leaving riches unfulfilled. The Arctic reminds us geography is not fixed. As ice melts, new prisons and new opportunities appear. And so the book closes on the same lesson it began with: maps are not just pictures. They are the bars and the pathways of history. Nations may dream, leaders may plan, but the land and sea beneath them still whisper the loudest voice.